Okay, welcome to part 2 of Psychology 102, Lifespan Development. So this is the second video in this chapter. So let's proceed. We're going to pick up from the phase, what's known as infancy and childhood, part 1. Okay, so even though, most newborn infants, they are physically kind of helpless, but they have reflexes and sensory capabilities that automatically, naturally enhance their chances for survival. Okay, so we're going to take a look at some of those a little more in detail in just a moment. Okay, so let's proceed. So we have to keep in mind here, so here's some of the questions, like, well, how do the senses in the brain development after the child is born? And what roles do things like temperament and attachment play in social and personality development? And then what are the stages of language development? So we're going to take a look at some of these, especially the first two questions we're going to look at a little more in depth. Okay, so when we talk about reflexes, remember I mentioned reflexes are developed they're naturally occurring in most healthy individuals, as soon as they're born. And some of these reflexes are kind of interesting to think about. Things like rooting, so turning the head and opening the mouth. Okay. Things like sucking on things. Okay. And, fanning and curling toes when the foot is stroked. Okay, so that's what's known as the Babinski reflex. Kind of an interesting term, but that comes from a developmental psychologist. And then last but not least, there is the reflex, what's known as grasping. So when the baby, will grab your finger and things like that. And and then try to lift itself up. And those are all factors that are occurring naturally within the individual in order to help it to grow and survive and to interact with the environment. Now, what's interesting about all of this is a lot of these things, we adults, so to speak, we tend to look at a baby and sort of think, oh, that baby's just being kind of silly, it keeps putting stuff in its mouth, things like that. And that's part of the baby's development and growth of its brain, by putting things in its mouth, because what it's doing is it's interacting with the environment and it's actually getting information from the environment, which helps it to understand what the environment has to offer, and therefore its brain grows along with that the intake of that information, so to speak. I hope that makes sense to you. So the baby is not just being silly when it's putting things in its mouth, or when it's grasping or feeling or anything like that. That's an important part of its development. Okay, and then briefly here, things like, the baby's senses, start to develop, things like vision. Okay, so when it comes to vision, in summary, basically, we all, are familiar with that for those of us who have had experience, being around newborn infants and things, they usually they respond if we're very close to their face. Okay, and that's because their eyes are not working together and in combination with their brain optimally. So they're actually able to see a little more better and actually take in information from the environment, when things are closer to them, between, like half a foot and a foot away from their eyes. And as as their prefrontal cortex starts to mature and, they start to mature biophysically, so to speak, and everything, well, they will, the range of their vision will start to increase. They'll start to see things from a further distance. And so things like hearing, okay, and I won't go into too much detail on that, but that's another sense that is in development. Okay, and so here's some important factors, okay, that, facts that I would like to make you aware of, and you'd think you may find this kind of interesting. The terminology is kind of important here too. So during infancy, the brain, it actually grows to approximately, 75% of its adult weight, which tends to surprise most students. It's like, wow, so as an infant, the brain actually develops, and grows to like 75% of its adult weight. Okay. And so, what is important to just keep in mind, is that's actual neuronal development. The neurons are growing throughout the brain. And remember, the neurons from Psychology 101, we covered this quite often, is the neurons are how the brain actually communicates with other types of other parts of the brain and parts of the body, as well as to interact socially with the environment. Okay, so that is what's an important factor in that growth of the brain during infancy. Okay, so I'm going to go forward just a little bit. I'm not going to worry too much about these terms, but feel free to pause the video and take notes, which I highly recommend. Okay, so here's some of the motoric development that occurs in most children or infants. Okay, and when you notice I use the term motoric, meaning motor development, okay, their ability to actually move. And so these are just some things you don't have to memorize, all of these, ages and what they're capable of engaging in motorically speaking. Okay, but you may want to pause the video and just sort of look this over. More FYI type. Okay. Okay, so you may have remembered, that I mentioned the term temperament a little bit earlier. So the temperament of a baby is basically, their predisposition, to consistently behave and react in a certain way. So some infants might be a little more easy, easy to get along with, easy to work with. And some infants may be a little slower to warm up. You know what I mean? So it requires a little more interaction and be just a little bit slower to go through the processes, of interaction with the environment. And then last but not least, another form of temperament is what's known as difficult. And so, that's when the baby may, be throwing tantrums and crying a lot and not interacting as easily with others. So just wanted to make you aware of that. That refers to temperament, though. That does not refer to personality. Okay, that's temperament. Okay, so we don't have to memorize this. This is just FYI. So I'm going to move forward on this. Now keep in mind, on any of these things that I move forward on, you can pause the video at any point and look a little more in depth on your own, okay? So when it comes to things like temperament, we have to keep in mind that there are various factors. And things like genetic factors as well as biological factors can be influential in a baby's temperament. Moving forward. Okay, so this is more FYI type of things, okay? Okay, and when it comes, we're going to start taking a look at attachment styles, okay? So attachment is how babies form an emotional bonds with others, with other humans. Basically, in conclusion, you can see here really quickly before I proceed here, you can see from this visual image, that this young monkey, is clinging on to basically what it thinks is another monkey, maybe a larger monkey, like its mother or something, and is clinging because it's seeking out. That kind of goes in line with the idea that all humans, not only humans, but a lot of types of a lot of types, they are animals, including, so we humans, we require that, according to even those a lot of humans, as they develop and they interact with the environment, they develop different emotional, what's called attachment styles. Okay. But keep in mind, as that definitely the things, like attachment styles and everything, and attachment, that refers to interaction with other human beings, so to speak. So attachment is what's known as the emotional bond that forms between the infant and caregivers, especially their parents, etc., during their first formative years of their life. Okay. Nothing to memorize on this slide. This is just trying to get you kind of acquainted with this information and thinking this way. Just kind of big picture type information. So when it comes to attachment, there are different styles, so what's known as securely attached. And basically that's when the child, feels free to, when the mothers are around, they basically, they feel safe in order to explore the room, the environment and everything. But they may become a little more upset and a little more scared, when their mothers leave the room or the caregivers leave the room. But they tend to, if the caregiver shows back up in the room, they tend to be happy again. Okay, but their insecure attachment or insecurely attached babies, they are less likely to explore the environment, even when their mothers are present. Okay, so they, their temperament might not allow them to do that. Okay, so we've talked about, some of the factors, the social factors as well as the biological factors. Now we're going to start talking about some of the psychological factors, or now keep in mind, whenever I use the term psychological, more often than not, I'm referring to cognitive type processes, okay? So one developmental psychologist who was a cognitive psychologist was Piaget. That's how you pronounce this name, Piaget. And he was interested, he basically, because he was a cognitive therapist, he said, look, what I'm interested in is I would like to research how individuals, how their cognitive processes develop as they develop through the lifespan. And so once, as a result of his research, he proposed different cognitive stages. Okay? So there are 4 stages of cognitive development according to Piaget, and we'll take a look at those. And so here is Piaget right here, okay? And basically, Piaget said, look, as a result of his studies, he sort of observed that children, they try to make sense of the environment. So they're basically actively interacting with the environment instead of being passive and soaking up information. Okay? So he called the 4 phases as they develop, there are 4 phases of cognitive development are sensorimotor, preoperational, concrete operational, and formal operational. So those are fairly, important terms to not only memorize, but just be acquainted with and understand them conceptually. So sensorimotor, that refers to, their first phase. Well, basically they're cognitive type processes. Well, those are prompted by their interaction with the environment through their senses. How their members, I mentioned, that infants and everything, they tend to engage in things, like tasting, sucking, grasping, things like that. Well, that is sensory, and that is how they interact with the environment. And so hence, the term sensorimotor. Okay? Grasping, tasting, sucking, things like that. Okay? Listening. That's their senses. Okay. Now, pre-operational, we're going to take a look. We're going to go forward and we're going to take a look at some of these a little more in depth, So, as a child advances to each stage, their thinking becomes different. Okay? Qualitatively. And you see I put that right here, qualitatively. And so qualitatively just means their thinking is, the quality of their thinking is different. Okay? That's all we have to really be really worried about right now. And not even worried, but just sort of just focused on. Okay. So basically the change of that modality or style of thinking, that occurs in order to enable the infant to accommodate new knowledge. Okay? So remember, they're experiencing cognitive development through social interaction. Okay, and through that social interactive type process, they're accommodating new knowledge, which results in the development of their cortex. So, we're going to take a look at each of these stages according to Piaget, just very briefly. So I already talked to you about the sensorimotor stage. So information is gained through the senses and motor actions. So when a baby, as like I mentioned earlier, as it's grasping, sucking, tasting, things like that, as well as kicking its feet and moving and waving its arms and things like that, that's motor actions. It's enabling it to interact with the environment. Hence sensorimotor. Okay? Now during this phase here, most infants, they achieve what's called object permanence, understanding that objects exist independent of one's actions or perceptions of them. So basically, before they're 6 months old, infants, they tend to think that, if an object is not within sight, well, they are sort of assuming that the object does not exist any longer. And so, I gave an example here and I said, things like peekaboo, so, if a person sort of hides their eyes and then all of a sudden uncovers their eyes and says peekaboo, then the child all of a sudden thinks that's a new occurrence, and So I just wanted to give you an example of that. We won't go into that too much in depth. Okay, the next phase is what Piaget called the preoperational stage, between 2 and 7 years old. And so basically, the preoperational stage, basically, that's when the child is able to engage in what's called symbolic thought. Okay, so basically, symbolism. So it doesn't have to be literal, it can be symbolic. Okay, so one object can stand for another. Okay, so yeah, I will just proceed from this point on without making things too confusing. Now, definitely, we have to keep in mind that a child, because of its development of its brain, so to speak, okay, and especially, the things, like certain parts of the brain, they tend to be a little more dominant, so it does, its prefrontal cortex isn't really as strongly developed as well as maybe the parts of the brain like what's known as the limbic system. And the limbic system is how, as an individual receives information from the environment, and then that information is sent to the prefrontal cortex. But if the prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed and it's not able to think about the information it's receiving, well, the individual may experience more of an emotional type response instead of a logical response. Okay, and and especially children, as we notice, they tend to, if they're not happy, if something's not going the way they want it to and everything, they will just cry. It's more emotional. They don't think about it, because they don't have prefrontal cortex maturation yet. And that sort of engagement, in oneself, like, hey, I'm just not happy about this, hence I'm going to cry, or I'm going to be angry, or I'm going to throw a fit. That is what's known as egocentrism. Okay? So the individual, because it's responding to more of the limbic system type information, it's more focused on itself and its own emotional response to environmental information. Now, a couple of these terms here I thought I would just make, very, very briefly make you, acquainted with. Irreversibility, that just means, the child, that's the term that refers to the child's thoughts that, well, things are always going to stay the same. It's irreversible. So, mom, will always be the same, or dad will always be the same, or, it's play toy or something. But if it changes, like say mom gets a haircut or something, then that actually can make the child respond emotionally because it didn't, was not even capable of thinking about the idea that things can change. Okay? Hence, irreversibility. Okay, that's all I'm going to talk about on this here. That's going forward here. Okay, so you may have noticed on the previous slide, I skipped ahead a little bit, but there was another, after we talked about irreversibility, we also talked about, well, cognitively speaking, children tend to engage in what Piaget called conservation as well. And that's because their brain, especially their prefrontal cortex, isn't developed. It has not achieved the kind of maturation that allows them to think logically through a process in order to solve a problem. So this is just an example, and I'll be very brief about this. Conservation, well, this child right here thinks that there is more milk in the tall glass than there is in the shorter glass because it's taller. And that is what Piaget called conservation. Okay? Now keep in mind, these are all the result of not fully matured prefrontal cortexes yet. Remember the prefrontal cortex, we looked at that very, very much in depth in Psychology 101, and we became very familiar with the idea that maturation of the prefrontal cortex is one of the most important things that humans achieve. And as they solve problems and make sense of the world and everything, that is their prefrontal cortex that allows them to do that. Engage in what's called executive functions. Okay, so concrete operational thought. Okay, that is the concrete operational stage according to Piaget, from 7 years old into adolescence. Okay, that's when, as a result of maturation of the prefrontal cortex, younger individuals are starting to think a little more logically. They become a little less egocentric. They're starting to say, hey, I don't have to react, I don't have to cry about this anymore, or this scenario or something. I don't have to react emotionally. I'll just think about it, and I'll come up with a logical decision or a plan or something. Okay. Now, from adolescence to adulthood, according to Piaget, individuals progress into what's known as the formal operational stage. And so that is definitely the formal operational is when individuals are able to engage in more very logical thinking processes. Okay. Okay, so this is just a quick summarization. Here's a visual image for if you want to review this material on your own. This would be a good place to stop on the video and take a look at this. All right. Now for this, for our purposes, we are not going to worry about the criticisms of Piaget's theories so much right now. Okay, so I'm being very quick and more in a summarizing, but one of the main criticisms of Piaget's theories, cognitive theories, is basically Piaget focused the majority of his efforts on looking at the cognitive abilities of infants and children. Okay, but you remember, in order to, psychologists, to more thoroughly look at a topic or a subject or anything, we have to take a look at it from the biological, the psychological, and the sociological perspectives, the biopsychosocial. And I know I'm, those of you who know me well, you've probably heard me say that 1,000 times, but I do that on purpose because I want to gently remind you, or maybe not so gently remind you, that looking at everything from the biological, psychological, and sociological perspectives is so very important. Okay, so I'm skipping forward here. Feel free to pause the video at any point. I'm skipping forward in order to save us some time. Okay, so I'm going to stop the video at this point. Okay, this is the end of part 2 of this chapter, and we'll catch up together on part 3, the next video in this chapter. Okay, so good luck with everything. I will see you soon. Goodbye.